Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into the mind, or, well, maybe the anti-mind, of a figure who really defined the trajectory of 20th century psychology.
He really did.
This is a man who was simultaneously an American scientist, a utopian novelist, a radical philosopher, and an inventor who tried to use trained pigeons to guide U.S. Navy missiles.
Which is just an incredible thing to have on your resume.
Right. We are talking about Burrhus Frederick Skinner, but of course everyone knows him as B.F. Skinner.
And when you say he designed the trajectory, that's not hyperbole at all. I mean, there was a major survey in 2002 that ranked Skinner as the single most influential psychologist of the entire 20th century.
Wow.
Yeah, he was placed on the same level as, the absolute pioneers like Ivan Pavlov and John B. Watson. His work was just so comprehensive. It spanned theory, practical application, philosophy, everything.
Exactly. So our mission today is to do a real deep dive into the specifics of his work. We want to cut through some of the mythology.
Oh, there's a lot of it.
A lot of it, especially the myths around his most controversial inventions. And we want to understand the mechanics of his radical behaviorism, the principles of operant conditioning he developed, and of course, his hugely polarizing social blueprint for a controlled, happy society.
I think the foundational takeaway you need right from the start is that Skinner developed behavior analysis and basically founded the entire field of the experimental analysis of behavior.
He didn't just propose a theory.
Not at all. He built the infrastructure to test it. He invented the foundational tools of the trade, the operant conditioning chamber, which everyone immediately started calling the Skinner box,
Right.
and the cumulative recorder, which was this ingenious mechanical device that actually allowed him to precisely measure and chart the whole process of learning.
What's so fascinating about Skinner's intellectual path is that the man who would dedicate his entire life to analyzing empirical, observable behavior, he started out wanting to analyze the inner human experience.
He wanted to be a novelist.
He wanted to write great American novels.
Yeah, he was born in 1904 in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. His father was a lawyer. And you can see these early signs of the radical thinker he'd become.
Like what?
Well, he became an atheist pretty early on. And it was mainly because he had this profound fear of hell that his grandmother had instilled in him. And a religious teacher then completely failed to calm that fear.
So the traditional explanations didn't work for him.
They didn't provide any rational comfort, and that seems to be what started his move away from these internal metaphysical explanations toward external verifiable ones.
And even before he got into psychology, his interests were super mechanical and practical.
Yeah.
It shows that, that intrinsic connection he had between theory and actually building things.
Oh, completely. His closest childhood friendship was with a boy named Raphael Doc Miller, and they bonded intensely over gadgets and contraptions.
They were constantly inventing.
Constantly. I mean, you can see the precursor to the Skinner box mentality right there. They set up this confusing telegraph line between their houses.
I love this story.
It was so unreliable that, as the story goes, they often had to follow up with a phone call to explain what the message was supposed to be. But they tried. They were natural engineers.
My favorite anecdote, which is just pure quintessential B.F. Skinner, involves their elderberry business.
Oh, the elderberry machine.
The elderberry machine. So they found that when they picked the ripe berries, a bunch of the unripe ones would come along too, which was inefficient.
Right. So what do?
You observe the problem, and then you build a machine to control the environment for a specific outcome. They bent a piece of metal into a trough and ran water down it.
And the ripe berries, which were denser, would sink and get carried into a bucket.
While the unripe, more buoyant ones would just get pushed over the edge and discarded.
And that's his whole life's thesis in microcosm right there. Observe a natural interaction and then create an environment to control the variables for the result you want.
That mechanical side was there, but the ambition was literary at first. He went to Hamilton College aiming to be a writer. He got his B.A. in English literature in 1926.
But he felt like a total outsider there. He was described as having a strong intellectual attitude, and he was openly critical of the college's traditional social norms and, their mores, especially being an atheist in that environment.
And that leads directly to what he later called his dark years.
Yeah.
After he graduated, he spent about 2.5 years trying to write a novel, and it was, by his own admission, a complete failure.
He felt he just didn't have the life experience. He didn't have the personal perspective you need for profound literature, even though he'd gotten encouragement from the poet Robert Frost.
So he was totally disillusioned with writing.
But that failure was probably the greatest gift he could have given to the science of psychology. While he was struggling with literature, He came across the work of John B. Watson.
The father of behaviorism.
Exactly. And Watson's insistence on studying only observable behavior, well, it gave Skinner a whole new intellectual framework, a tangible mission. And that led him straight to graduate study in psychology at Harvard, where he got his PhD in 1931.
And this is where the genius of the contraption builder finally merges with the scientist.
Right. At Harvard, a fellow student named Fred Keller convinced Skinner that behavior could be a real experimental science with precise tools.
And that was it.
That was it. That conversation immediately led Skinner to invent the prototype for the operant conditioning chamber and collaborate on other instruments. It turned him from a failed novelist into this incredibly rigorous experimentalist.
His career progression from there was, textbook brilliance.
Absolutely. He stayed on as a researcher at Harvard for a few years, then moved into teaching roles, first at the University of Minnesota in 1936. Then he was department chair at Indiana University, starting in 1945.
But the big one was coming back to Harvard.
The major homecoming. He returned to Harvard in 1948 as a tenured professor, the Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology. And he held that position until he retired in 1974.
And unlike a lot of academics who just sort of fade after retirement, Skinner didn't slow down at all.
Not even a little. He was a vibrant voice, writing, speaking, revising his theories right up until his death from leukemia in 1990. He was 86.
And it's almost unbelievable that just 10 days before he passed away, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Psychological Association.
Giving one last address to the scientific world that he completely reshaped. It's incredible end to the story.
So we move from the inventor to the philosopher. This is really where Skinner earns the label radical. His school of thought, radical behaviorism, was a profound intellectual reaction to the psychology of the time, especially depth psychology, and any theory that relied on hypothetical internal states like mind or will.
Right.
So help us dissect that a bit. What was the true danger he saw in talking about internal feelings?
The danger for Skinner was really twofold. First, the core assumption of radical behaviorism is actually pretty simple. Behavior is purely a consequence of environmental histories of reinforcement. Full stop.
So if you want to know why you act the way you do, you look outside yourself.
You look at the external variables that have shaped your responses, not some, ethereal inner driver.
But if you reject mentalism entirely, aren't you severely limiting what you can even study about human experience? Where does that leave complex internal things like grief or creativity or even just thinking? Most people intuitively feel their thoughts cause their actions.
And that's the critical tension he's addressing. Skinner's position wasn't that internal experience didn't exist. He just rejected the idea that it was a non-physical mind or consciousness acting as some kind of internal agent.
So what are feelings then?
To him, what is felt or introspectively observed, all those thoughts, feelings, sensations, they're simply the observer's own body and the collateral products of their genetic and environmental histories.
They're effects, not causes.
Exactly. You feel anxious because of your environmental history, not because some little anxiety-causing entity lives inside your head.
So he saw internal feelings and thoughts as part of the total behavioral picture, but not the explanation for it. So if I say, I'm running because I feel determined, Skinner would say that the feeling of determination is just another side effect of the environmental factors, like a history of successful exercise, that actually caused the running in the first place.
You've got it. And this is why he disliked what he called mental fictions. He argued that attributing an action to an internal feeling brings investigation to an end.
What does that mean?
Well, if a parent asks why their child hit another child, and the answer is because he felt angry, the parent stops looking.
They stop looking for the real, observable environmental conditions.
The triggers, the consequences, the things that actually produce the aggressive behavior in the first place.
So it perpetuates ignorance of the environment's actual powerful role. It kind of lets us off the hook from analyzing our complex external history of reinforcement.
That's it. He made this really pointed observation that for like 2.5 millennia, philosophers were preoccupied with these internal feelings and the structure of mental life. But it was only in the early 20th century that anyone got serious about a systematic analysis of the environment's role.
So to him, behaviorism was just psychology finally catching up to where physics and chemistry had been for centuries?
Focusing on the verifiable. And that focus is why his research centered so intensely on operant conditioning. He stressed that these carefully controlled environments, like the Skinner box, were the only reliable way to observe learning.
By isolating variables, you can accurately establish the principles of learning.
And then those principles, once you've established them, can be applied to vastly complex human contexts like therapy, education, and organizational management. His entire goal was to move psychology from philosophy to engineering.
Okay, so moving from the philosophy to the science,
Uh,
Skinner had to create a structured framework for observation. And in his 1938 book, The Behavior of Organisms, he lays out this critical distinction between two sorts of behavior.
And this distinction is so crucial because it's what really differentiates his work from classical behaviorism. The first type, which he totally acknowledged Pavlov had studied exhaustively, is respondent behavior.
These are reflexes.
Reflexes. They are behaviors elicited by specific stimuli. A puff of air makes you blink. The smell of food makes you salivate. They're induced by an antecedent stimulus, and you typically measure them by their latency, how quickly they happen, or their strength.
And then the second type, the one that makes Skinner, is operant behavior.
Right. And the key difference here is that these behaviors are emitted, which means they're not initially triggered by an obvious specific stimulus. They're voluntary, purposeful actions that an organism uses to operate on the environment.
And these are the behaviors that are strengthened when they produce a desirable outcome.
A reinforcer, through operant conditioning.
Mm.
And you measure these not by latency, but by their rate, how frequently the organism performs the action over time.
But that difference immediately raises a huge question. If an operant response isn't elicited by a stimulus, where does it even come from? Where do new behaviors originate?
And Skinner's answer is beautiful because it connects his work directly to biology. He draws a direct analogy to Darwinian evolution.
That's the concept of variation and selection.
Exactly. Individual behaviors, just like genetic traits, vary constantly. A rat might press a lever slightly harder one time, or a pigeon cocks its head a little differently. A variation that just happens to be followed by reinforcement is selected.
And it's strengthened, becoming a more prominent part of that individual's behavioral repertoire.
It's selection by consequences operating on individual actions instead of over generations. It's evolution in miniature.
And the specific term he coined for modifying this variation is shaping.
Shaping, which is the gradual modification of behavior by consistently reinforcing variations that get closer and closer to the desired outcome.
It's like using a hot and cold game to guide a complex behavior.
Perfect analogy. You start by reinforcing the pigeon for just facing the key, then for taking a step toward it, then for touching it, until you finally get the full peck established.
So once the behavior is shaped, the next question is how you direct or control it. If the behavior is just emitted and doesn't have a constant trigger, how do we know when it's going to happen?
And this is where the discriminative stimulus, or SD, comes in. The SD, say, a light or a specific sound. It doesn't force the behavior. It just sets the occasion for reinforcement.
So a pigeon learns that pecking the disc only yields food when the light is red. The red light is the discriminative stimulus.
Precisely. And that whole structure is the three-term contingency. It's the fundamental building block of his entire experimental analysis. Stimulus, response, reinforcer, or as it's often called, ABC, antecedent behavior consequence.
And that framework provides a systematic way to analyze behavior that goes way beyond simple two-part stimulus-response associations.
And that framework is what allows us to analyze complexity, because complex human behavior is rarely a single act. Skinner explained complexity through chaining.
He viewed complex behavior as a sequence of simpler responses all linked together.
Yes, and the genius of chaining is how it explains motivation across a really long sequence. The discriminative stimulus for the next step in the chain also acts as a conditioned reinforcer for the step you just completed.
So, like, if a child is being taught a long sequence of chores, the sight of the clean kitchen sink is the SD for the next step, wiping the counter.
But it also acts as a conditioned reinforcer for the preceding step, which was putting the dishes away.
You build these long, complex behavioral sequences by linking these three-term contingencies together.
Exactly. He described an animal sequence. Noise, turnaround, light, press, lever, food. The noise sets the occasion for the turnaround. The sight of the light reinforces the turnaround and sets the occasion for the press. It just chains together.
But even chaining kind of struggles to explain truly novel human actions, like when you get directions to a building you've never seen before.
Right. For that, he introduced rule-governed behavior.
Okay.
Rule-governed behavior accounts for complex human actions that just appear without any direct history of reinforcement for that specific action. This happens when simple behaviors, like following a command, come under the control of verbal stimuli.
So once a person has an established history of being reinforced for following instructions, like go left when I say left.
Then a sequence of verbal stimuli, a set of directions, can evoke an almost unlimited variety of complex, novel responses, even if the final behavior has never been reinforced before. The rule stands in for the direct environmental contingency.
So if the three-term contingency is the structure and chaining builds complexity, then reinforcement is the fuel.
It's the engine.
Let's tackle reinforcement and punishment because these are probably the most frequently misused terms in common language. We need to define them clearly and then look at their power in practice.
It is absolutely essential to reiterate. Reinforcement always strengthens behavior. The terms positive and negative are just mathematical operators. They're not moral judgments.
Right, so positive reinforcement is strengthening behavior by the addition or occurrence of an event. Real-world example. You offer a suggestion in a meeting, that's the behavior, and your boss immediately gives you praise or credit, the positive event. That makes you more likely to offer suggestions again.
And negative reinforcement is strengthening behavior by the removal or avoidance of an aversive event. Crucially, the behavior is strengthened because something bad goes away.
Like silencing an annoying alarm clock.
Perfect. The behavior pressing the snooze button is reinforced because it successfully removes the irritating noise. Or if you have a headache, taking a pill is reinforced because the behavior removes the pain.
So both of these actions make the behavior more likely to happen again. The key distinction is just application versus removal. Okay, now let's pivot to the flip side. How we weaken or decrease behavior. This brings us to punishment and extinction.
Right, and punishment aims to decrease behavior. But Skinner argued it was ineffective and created all these collateral problems. Punishment involves either the application of an aversive stimulus
That's positive punishment, like a reprimand or a fine.
or the removal of a desirable stimulus.
Negative punishment, like a timeout or losing access to a video game.
Let's use a consistent example to make the four terms really clear. Imagine a child who draws on the wall.
Okay.
Positive reinforcement. The child cleans their room and then receives an ice cream. The addition of the ice cream strengthens the cleaning behavior.
Negative reinforcement. The child cleans their room and the nagging from their parents stops. The removal of the nagging strengthens the cleaning behavior.
Positive punishment. The child draws on the wall and is immediately yelled at. The addition of the yelling is meant to decrease the drawing behavior.
And negative punishment. The child draws on the wall and loses their TV privileges for the day. The removal of the TV is meant to decrease the drawing behavior.
And Skinner's skepticism about punishment was just unwavering. He argued it causes temporary suppression at best, and it introduces all these unwanted consequences.
Like teaching the person to just avoid the punisher?
Exactly, or creating emotional responses like fear and anxiety that generalize to the whole environment. For behaviorists, the preferred way to weaken a behavior is extinction, which is simply withholding reinforcement when the behavior occurs. If the lever press no longer yields food, the lever pressing eventually just stops. It goes extinct.
And this whole system, Skinner argued, wasn't just some psychological trick. He saw it as a fundamental law of nature.
Oh yeah. In his really powerful 1981 paper, Selection by Consequences, he connected the process of reinforcement directly to the broader biological context of Darwinian natural selection.
What was the argument?
He was arguing that there were three levels of selection by consequences. Natural selection, which selects genetic traits, operant conditioning, which selects behaviors within a lifetime, and culture, which selects behavioral practices across generations.
So he felt that while natural selection was universally accepted, the psychological selection process reinforcement was still viewed with skepticism.
Largely because of that enduring belief in the autonomous inner agent. It's an incredibly profound claim that a single mechanical principle governs adaptation across biology, behavior, and culture.
The mechanism by which this selective pressure truly molds behavior in the lab and in life is through the schedules of reinforcement,
which he detailed with Charles Furster in their massive, seminal 1957 work, Schedules of Reinforcement. This book analyzed how the timing and frequency of reinforcement dramatically alter the rate and pattern of responses.
Let's look at the 5 main schedules because they really do define so much of modern human life.
Okay. The easiest way to teach a new behavior is continuous reinforcement, CRF, where every single response is reinforced. It establishes behavior quickly, but it's fragile.
If you stop reinforcing, the behavior quickly goes extinct.
Right. Most of our behavior is maintained by intermittent schedules, which are based either on time interval or the number of responses ratio. Let's start with fixed interval, FI.
Reinforcement is delivered after a fixed amount of time has passed, as long as a response is made.
This creates a really unique and recognizable pattern because the subject knows when the next opportunity for reinforcement is coming, the response rate is super low right after they get the reward.
And then it rapidly accelerates just before the interval expires.
Exactly. If we chart this on a cumulative recorder, it creates the famous scallop pattern. Think of studying for an exam. Intense studying, responding right before the test reinforcement, and then a huge drop-off right after the exam is over.
Next is variable interval 6, where reinforcement is available after unpredictable amounts of time, since you never know exactly when the opportunity will arrive.
This schedule yields the most steady and stable rate of responding. 6 is the engine of so many of our digital behaviors. Checking your email, checking social media.
You don't know when a new rewarding message will arrive, so you just maintain a constant, steady rate of checking.
So you don't miss it. It's highly effective at maintaining long-term, low-rate behaviors.
Okay, moving to ratio schedules, which are based on output fixed ratio, FR, reinforcement, after a specific fixed number of responses.
A factory worker gets paid after assembling 10 items, or a child gets a sticker after completing 5 homework problems.
This produces a high rate of responding, but usually with a brief pause right after the reinforcement is received.
The post-reinforcement break. They get the reward, they pause, take a breath, and then start the next set of required responses. Sales commissions often work this way.
And the final, and maybe the most powerful schedule, is variable ratio,
Yeah.
VR.
Yes. Reinforcement occurs after a randomized, unpredictable number of responses.
And this is famous because it generates the highest and steadiest rate of responding.
Sometimes called breakpoint behavior because the subject will often just continue until they're physically exhausted. The classic example, of course, is the slot machine.
Where a win might come after 1 pull or 100 pulls or 500, totally randomly.
And because the next pull might be the winner, the behavior is incredibly resistant to extinction and is just intensely maintained. It's the engine of addictive behavior, whether it's gambling or grinding for loot drops in a video game.
And the ultimate application of all these schedules in a structured setting is the token economy.
Right. These systems, which are used in psychiatric hospitals, schools, therapeutic environments, they use token secondary reinforcers to shape behavior. Desirable actions earn tokens.
And those tokens can later be exchanged for primary reinforcers. Food, privileges, leisure time. It's a complete controlled society built purely on operant principles.
Let's pivot back to the inventor, because Skinner's legacy isn't just conceptual, it's physical. He was one of the few psychologists who could actually build the tools necessary to test his theories.
And his scientific career is completely dependent on the operant conditioning chamber, the Skinner box, which he first built as a prototype at Harvard.
And its design was just radical in its simplicity and effectiveness.
The classic design had the manipulandum, a lever for a rat or a disc for a pigeon, and a mechanism to deliver a reinforcer, usually food pellets.
Or, alternatively, electric shocks as a punishment.
Yeah.
But the real genius was the environmental control. By isolating the animal and controlling all the variables, the lights, the tones, the consequences, the timing, you could analyze behavior with this unprecedented precision.
The chamber enabled huge progress, especially in measuring response rate, probability, and force, the things that were quantifiable.
But it also had an unintended consequence. By steering research toward these measurable variables, it kind of discouraged the study of processes that weren't easily conceptualized that way, like spatial learning or instinctual drift, which are now core areas of behavioral science.
And to measure that response rate accurately, he invented the cumulative recorder.
Before computers, this was the central piece of technology, a purely mechanical device. A pen was mounted on an arm, and a sheet of paper unrolled beneath it at a constant speed. Every time the subject responded,
Press the lever.
then stepped upward just a little bit.
This was so brilliant because the steepness of the incline instantly and visually showed you the response rate.
A vertical line meant rapid, continuous responding like a VR schedule, while a flat line meant no responding at all. This allowed Forster and Skinner to visually identify and categorize all the distinct patterns produced by their schedules of reinforcement.
Now we get to the truly strange inventions, starting with Project Pigeon. You have to set the stage for this. It's World War II, and the U.S. Navy desperately needs an effective, small guidance system for missiles.
And the irony is rich. The problem was that the existing technology was too bulky. So Skinner, the behaviorist, proposes a biological solution.
The project, codenamed Project Pigeon, and later Project Orcon for organic control, was centered on training pigeons to guide the missiles.
The concept was kind of simple. A Nissel's nose cone would have 3 compartments, each with a trained pigeon inside. Lenses projected an image of the enemy ship onto a hinged screen in front of the birds, like a camera obscura.
And the pigeons were reinforced for pecking the screen, which, if they were aiming correctly, would show the ship right in the center.
And the key mechanism was control. When the pigeons pecked the screen to keep the image centered, their pecking controlled pneumatic tubes attached to the missile's guidance system, which in turn adjusted the bomb's thrusters.
And he actually trained them to do this in the lab.
Oh yeah, he successfully demonstrated that the system was technically viable.
It sounds like a terrible joke, pigeons guiding missiles, but the seriousness of it all reminds you how desperately scientists were trying to innovate during the war.
And it says he had absolute faith in the power of controlled behavior, even for military application. Ultimately, though, the Navy dropped the project.
He often complained no one would take us seriously.
Right. And while the tech was briefly picked up again by the Naval Research Laboratory, it was discontinued. Too many uncontrollable factors like, having pigeons in your supply chain for warfare.
In a fitting, if slightly absurd, tribute, the project was awarded the Ig Nobel Peace Prize in 2024.
Which is perfect.
So from the military to the nursery, his next invention, the air crib, became his most notorious domestic controversy.
This was an easily cleaned, enclosed bed designed for infants.
And the purpose was entirely practical. It was rooted in his desire to simplify child rearing for his wife and improve the baby's environment, especially in cold Minnesota.
It was temperature and humidity controlled, so it eliminated the need for heavy blankets or constricting clothes. It was meant to reduce laundry, minimize diaper rash, prevent cradle cap, just regulate the environment.
But the public perception, fueled by this sensationalized Ladies' Home Journal article he wrote called Baby in a Box, it was a disaster.
It was immediately and cruelly characterized as a cruel pen. He was often directly compared to the lab's Skinner box, suggesting he was experimenting on his own children.
This association just destroyed its commercial success, even though reports from parents who actually used the air crib were largely positive.
And the controversy followed his family for decades. His daughter, Deborah Skinner-Buzan, has had to publicly and repeatedly refute the persistent claim that she was raised in the air crib and used as a lab subject. She stated very clearly that it was just a comfortable, climate-controlled bed.
Finally, let's discuss his key educational invention, the teaching machine. This was his solution to the inefficiencies and the psychological harms of the standard classroom.
The machine was designed for programmed learning, and it embodied all his core principles. It presented questions one at a time, demanded an active response from the learner, and then immediately provided feedback.
It rewarded a correct answer instantly.
Automatic, immediate, and regular positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
It completely bypassed aversive control or the punishment of getting something wrong.
The pedagogical rationale was revolutionary for the time. The machine individualized the pace of learning. It promoted learning by doing instead of rote memorization.
And crucially, the system aimed for a very low error rate. If a student consistently failed, the machine or the program could be adjusted to provide less advanced prompts. It guaranteed success and therefore maximized reinforcement.
Skinner argued this positive approach was a sharp contrast to the traditional classroom, where instruction often relied on aversive control, fear of failure, or where entertainment was used before the required behavior, thus reinforcing nothing productive at all.
The teaching machine was really a blueprint for effective, humane instruction.
Skinner wasn't just interested in pigeons and pupils, though. He had grand plans for humanity itself.
He really did.
His social philosophy was driven by this hope that an effective science of behavioral control, what he called a technology of human behavior, could solve the problems that technology had created.
Like the threat of nuclear war. He thought it could prevent us from destroying ourselves.
This ambition was first explored in his 1948 utopian novel, Walden Two.
Right. The book described this experimental, self-sufficient community in the 1940s U.S., where scientific social planning and operant conditioning are used to engineer high productivity, happiness, and social stability.
The community's philosophy centered on minimal consumption, rich social relationships, creative work, and lots of leisure time, all achieved by steering behavior away from greed and conflict.
And the book was incredibly influential. It served as a blueprint for real-world efforts. The Twin Oaks community, founded in Virginia in 1967, openly used Walden Two as a guide for their communal structure.
But the work that truly thrust him into the cultural spotlight, the one that landed him on the cover of Time magazine, was his monumental and highly controversial 1971 work Beyond Freedom and Dignity.
Wait, the idea that a technology of human behavior can fix society? That sounds dangerously close to authoritarian control, especially when you consider his premise.
Which was?
His core argument was that society must accept that the autonomous agent, that internal concept of a free inner person, is a fiction. It is not the driving force of our actions.
So how did Skinner address the obvious ethical recoil to that concept? I mean, that's a tough one.
He argued that control is inevitable. All behavior is controlled. It's either controlled by aversive means like punishment and threats, or by positive means like reinforcement.
So since control is inescapable, we should abandon the fiction of autonomous freedom.
And choose to be controlled by the most humane and effective means. Positive reinforcement. He viewed our adherence to freedom as a defense mechanism that was preventing us from creating a truly effective, better society.
And that is the context for his famous provocative quote where he compares the old-fashioned liberal who insists on absolute freedom to Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost.
Yeah, Satan falls to hell, and to reassure himself, he declares, "Here at least we shall be free." The implication is just chilling. If you insist on unconditioned freedom, you might be left in a behavioral hell of inefficiency and conflict.
The ethical pushback was immense, yet his vision wasn't just confined to these grand social schemes. It permeated his ideas on teaching, which he detailed in The Technology of Teaching.
He outlined two major purposes of education. First, to teach specific repertoires of verbal and nonverbal behavior, the curriculum, and second, to genuinely interest students in learning.
And his focus remained on positive control in the classroom. He argued that traditional education relies way too heavily on punishment, fear of failing, fear of the teacher.
Which is ineffective because punishment primarily teaches avoidance. He used the visceral example of a child being forced to practice a musical instrument. The coercion makes the child associate practice with dread and aversion, creating a lifelong dislike of music, rather than genuine skill.
He believed teachers often failed, not because they weren't dedicated, but because they lacked an in-depth understanding of the science of learning.
They relied on poor procedures, using aversive control, relying on just telling and explaining, which he noted fails to provide any corrective reinforcement, failing to adapt tasks to the student's success level, and failing to provide frequent, immediate positive reinforcement.
So he blueprinted a specific, positive, and systematic 5-step teaching method to maximize success.
Step 1. Clearly specify the performance you expect from the student. You can't reinforce what you haven't defined.
Step 2. Break the task down into incredibly small, achievable steps.
Step 3. Let the student perform each step and provide immediate positive reinforcement for correct actions in every single step.
Step 4. Constantly adjust the difficulty and pacing to ensure constant success. You're aiming for a near-zero error rate.
And finally, step 5. Once the behavior is mastered, you shift the student to intermittent reinforcement to ensure the performance is maintained over the long term. Just like a VR schedule keeps a behavior going strong.
While his contributions to structured learning were immense, Skinner's theories were rarely accepted without a fight.
Almost never.
Let's start with one of his most famous yet heavily disputed experiments, the 1948 study, Superstition in the Pigeon.
This experiment was just so elegant in its design. Skinner placed hungry pigeons in a cage with a mechanism that delivered food at regular fixed intervals, say every 15 seconds, regardless of what the bird was doing.
So the reinforcement was accidental or adventitious. It wasn't contingent on any specific behavior.
And the result was spectacular. Because the food arrived randomly, the pigeons began associating the food delivery with whatever chance action they happened to be performing right when the food dropped.
One pigeon started turning counterclockwise. Another thrust its head violently into a corner.
A third started this consistent, pendulum-like head motion. They were behaving as if their random rituals were influencing the delivery of food.
And Skinner argued this was a perfect analogy for human superstition.
The athlete with the lucky socks, the gambler with a ritual before rolling the dice, the bowler twisting their arm after the ball has already left their hand as if they still control it.
That occasional accidental association between the ritual and a good outcome is enough, under an intermittent schedule, to maintain the superstitious behavior forever.
But this simple explanation has been robustly challenged. Subsequent research, particularly Stadden and Simmelhag in 1971, while they observed similar behaviors, they provided a key distinction. They argued that the terminal responses, the actions performed right before the food arrived, were better explained by classical conditioning, a process called auto-shaping, where the food presentation paired with the light cue automatically induces a conditioned response.
So the cause of the bizarre behaviors in between food deliveries is still up for debate.
It is. It proves that even the simplest Skinner box results can sometimes require a more nuanced explanation than pure adventitious reinforcement.
Okay, let's move to the most famous intellectual battle of his career,
Yeah.
the Great Chomsky Feud.
Well, yeah.
This conflict, which came from Noam Chomsky's 1959 critique of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, is widely considered the launch point of the cognitive revolution in psychology.
Right. So in Verbal Behavior from 1957, Skinner tried to explain human language acquisition using his operant framework. He defined verbal units as specific behaviors reinforced by a listener.
A mand, which is a request, reinforced by getting what you asked for, like water.
A tact, which is a naming, reinforced by social agreement, like that's a dog. And intraverbals, which are word associations in conversational flow. He believed all language could be reduced to these controlled responses.
Then Chomsky, who was a relatively unknown linguist at the time, unleashed this massive, devastating review in the journal language.
And his core argument was that Skinner's behavioral framework was fundamentally incapable of explaining the most important aspect of human language: generativity. Generativity. It's a child's ability to generate an infinite variety of novel sentences they've never heard before, that have never been reinforced before, and yet are grammatically correct.
And Chomsky argued that a theory based purely on conditioned responses could never account for this structural creativity.
He basically dismissed Skinner's framework as little more than word games. He accused him of overextending lab work to phenomena it just couldn't touch.
That critique struck right at the heart of behaviorism. If the radical behaviorist framework couldn't explain language, the most complex human behavior, then maybe it couldn't explain anything truly complicated.
It's hard to overstate the seismic impact of that review. It convinced an entire generation of academics to seek explanations inside the organism, in innate linguistic structures, cognitive rules, and that launched the cognitive movement.
What's so incredible and probably detrimental to Skinner's legacy is his silence. He never formally replied to Chomsky.
He claimed he found the tone distasteful and only read a few pages. He said Chomsky had misunderstood the difference between his radical behaviorism and earlier, simpler stimulus-response models.
But his failure to engage allowed Chomsky's argument to stand essentially unopposed in the mainstream academic mind for decades.
It accelerated the shift away from external analysis. And while Skinner's later supporters argued that Chomsky attacked a straw man, a caricature of behaviorism, the damage was done. The focus of psychology moved decisively inward.
Beyond the language battle, Skinner also received criticism from the psychodynamic world.
Although he was often portrayed as being aggressively anti-Freud, some analysts have pointed out that Skinner actually shared the psychoanalytic view that behavior often requires deep analysis because it's rarely what it appears to be on the surface.
And to study things like projection or subconscious thought, Skinner even designed the verbal summator,
which was a unique projective test. It was an auditory version of the Rorschach test, intended to reveal subconscious thoughts that were projected onto incomprehensible auditory garbage.
Finally, we have to include the serious claims made by animal behaviorist Temple Grandin.
Right.
In her 2005 book and later interviews, Grandin described meeting Skinner when she was 18. She claimed that during this encounter, Skinner attempted to touch her legs without her consent, and she verbally rebuffed him.
Grandin also asserted that Skinner, throughout his life, was dismissive of the importance of brain function in understanding behavior. She claimed he refused to engage with the neurological basis of her work with animals and only began to recognize the importance of the physical brain structure after he suffered a stroke later in life.
We present these claims as they stand within the historical record of critique directed at his personal and professional conduct.
So B.F. Skinner's story is this profound demonstration of intellectual commitment, moving from a frustrated novelist to the radical philosopher and experimental scientist who provided the framework for understanding consequences.
His career spanned decades at the intellectual center of American science. He earned the National Medal of Science in 1968 and that final deserved Lifetime Achievement Award in 1990.
And his legacy isn't just historical. His principles of operant conditioning are still absolutely central to interpreting how consequences impact actions in every modern domain.
Whether you are designing training for a corporate environment, developing therapy protocols, or even designing the addictive features of a social media platform,
you're using the core principles of the three-term contingency and schedules of reinforcement. The mechanism is just unavoidable in human life.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Skinner famously regretted that the scientific world readily accepted Darwin's natural selection as the mechanism for physical adaptation, but resisted reinforcement as the mechanism for behavioral adaptation.
He saw both as selection by consequences.
And that leads to the final provocative thought.
If we accept Skinner's premise that all behavior, from a pigeon's random ritual to your most complex moral decision, is fundamentally shaped by this relentless process of environmental selection, where do we genuinely locate the boundaries of free will?
If your choices are simply the reliable effects of a lifetime of environmental contingencies, what is left for the autonomous inner agent to actually choose?
Is free will merely the name we give to the actions whose environmental causes we have yet to fully analyze? That is the deep, unsettling question Skinner forces us to mull over.